So we've got a collective conversation on consent today. And so I'm just going to introduce it by providing a bit of context for the work in a sort of historical sense. And then we have two wonderful speakers, both activists and advocates for the field. And then we'll bring it back together in sort of a bit of a wrap up and a bit of a call to action. And in that session, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So if during the session you just pop questions into the chat as they emerge, then we won't be able to address all of them, but we'll address as many as we can in that session. And like Sharon, I would just like to give you a message of self-care because this material can be very challenging and very confronting, as all of us amongst us can be survivors, can be victims, and can be perpetrators of the sort of area of consent and its broader area of sexuality, education, respect for relationships. So it's important to acknowledge your own feelings. And as Sharon said, feel free to come and go as you please. But I would also just like to ask you to keep an open mind about the session and reflect on the contribution that parents make to this area, Parents Victoria make to this area, and the role that you can play. So look, what I'd like to begin with is I'd just like to ask the question, why do we need a collective conversation about consent? So I'm just going to cover a few key points. We don't have a lot of time, but the first one is because this education is not new. For the past 30 years, there has been an educational context and resources to address these issues in our government schools. In the early 90s, for example, I was part of a national project that developed a position paper to guide education nationally on gender-based violence education, of which consent is a key part. Now, that was distributed to all states and territories, to all government schools, primary and secondary. But here we are again, 30 years down the track, with the same issues emerging. So I just want to make the point that we need to look to the past as we move to the future, and just acknowledge that a lot of work has already been done in this space, but something hasn't worked. And I guess that moves me to the next point, really, the reality of the situation. You only have to open a newspaper on any day and any newspaper to find another illustration of issues related to consent, related to sexual assault, related to family violence. And often when I run sessions for my students or in other broader community contexts, I'll just do a quick scan of the key headlines in the public media, and there's enough to fill 5 PowerPoints. So that's the reality. What is different now to 30 years ago is that online space, and that really does present a number of challenges, and also for parents, as I'm sure you are all aware. The next point is the reason we need this conversation is young people are demanding it. They are demanding this conversation. We'll hear from Chanel and she'll talk about that. But even my own research with young people in secondary schools around what they want to know and how they want to learn about sexuality education, the key issue they want more information about is violence in relationships, then gender and sexuality, then starting and ending relationships. And I could go on with the key areas, but they are top priorities for our young people, and they are demanding this work. The next point I'd like to make is that the education context and resources are there. Particularly in Victoria, we have a suite of brilliant resources that have been developed over the last 30 years in sexuality education, in respectful relationships education, and now in consent education. But this area of consent fits within the broad scope of sexuality education. And what we have in Victoria, like no other state, is that we now have aspects of sexuality education mandated. We have respect for relationships education mandated. There are key resources already there. Consent education has been mandated. Our sexuality education resources in this state cover consent. And I guess I can say that because I've been involved in both developing the resources for Victoria over the last 25 years and also at a national sense, a national scene. So the resources are there. It's about support to implement it and embed it in quite competitive educational environment, but it needs to be embedded. But I think more importantly, particularly for this session, is we need this collective conversation to acknowledge that parents are the primary educators of their children in this space, as well as every other space. Parents educate their children about consent, about respect for relationships, about sexuality implicitly and explicitly all the time. It may be about their attitude to nudity. It may be the questioning of a sexist comment. It may be the resources they provide for their children. So it's really important to acknowledge the important role that parents play in this space. The next point I'd like to make, and related to that, is that I guess the research shows us that there are, in the area, particularly in family violence and violence against women, there are 4 key drivers, and they are the condoning of violence against women. They are men's control and decision-making and the limits to women's independence. They are the stereotypes around masculinities and femininities, a lack of inclusion, and they are also in terms of disrespect, towards women and male peers, condoning those attitudes. But the point I want to make is that parents are key to addressing these drivers early on. This is where it starts, where we sort of say education's got to start in early childhood, and Victoria has acknowledged that, and that's what's happening, but it needs to start from the day a child is born, about their bodies, about who has a right to touch it, who has a right to borrow something, who has a right to take your photo, who has a right to ask you to give them a kiss. These are all absolutely key areas that parents are involved in. Parents, there's 3 other key points I'd like to make, is that parents are the most trusted source of information for young people. And research has been done in Australia since 1992 in secondary schools, where questions around this were asked, and parents always emerge as one of the most trusted news sources of information. Mum is always very close to the top, about 2. Dad has always been a bit further down, around 6, although Dad has moved up, and there's obviously gender differences. But the point I make is that children trust their parents, and so they provide a wonderful source of information. Also, parents are the key support if an incident occurs. That's who kids go to if it is in a broader context than families. And I guess the last point I'd like to make, and I'll say more about this later at the end of the session, is that parents are the missing link in what we call the whole school approach to addressing respectful relationships, consent education, sexuality education. I've worked on a number of projects over the last 20 years working in whole school approaches. And as I said, this whole school approach is not new. It was developed back in 1992 for this area. But it always emerges as the missing link. And I've been engaged in the research around respectful relationships in schools with Our Watch, both in primary and secondary schools. And it has emerged again. What about parents? We need to work with parents. And so I think that in itself is, if it was the only reason, is an important reason. So I hope that's contextualised where we're going to with the rest of this session.